everyone. This is the CRTC technical briefing to discuss the CRTC's. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the CRTC technical briefing to discuss the CRTC's ongoing work to implement the Online Streaming Act. Bonjour à tous. Voici la séance d'information technique sur la mise en œuvre de la loi sur la diffusion continue en ligne par le CRTC. Nous commencerons par des commentaires suivis d'une séance de questions et réponses. Les informations fournies peuvent être attribuées à Scott Shortliff, dirigeant principal radiodiffusion, et à Daniel Pye, directeur général politique en matière de radiodiffusion. Leurs noms et titres se retrouvent dans le chat pour l'orthographie. We will begin with remarks, which will be followed by a Q&A period. Information provided can be attributed to Scott Shortliff, Vice President Broadcasting, and or Daniel Pye, Director General Broadcasting Policy. Names and titles will be listed in the chat for spelling. Scott, over to you. À vous la parole.
Bonjour, bon après-midi tout le monde. Very pleased to have you here today as we take our next step forward on implementing the Online Streaming Act. Today, we are launching a consultation on working towards a sustainable Canadian broadcasting system. En français, c'est travailler à l'établissement d'un système canadien de radiodiffusion durable. La plupart de mon présentation serait en anglais, mais c'est mon intention de présenter le contexte de nos objectifs et ainsi que les questions clés. À le point que je discute les questions clés, mon collègue, M. Pye, pourrait répéter en français. So I'm going to be, in this briefing, talking about our context, goals, and our key issues. When we get to key issues, my colleague, Mr. Pye, is going to repeat some of them in French just to make sure that they're clear in both official languages. So, I'm going to start with a bit of context. What are we trying to do today? We are trying to build a sustainable, fair, and competitive broadcasting system where Canadians can find the services and content they want. I'm going to repeat that several times in this presentation because we're going to talk a lot about how the business operates. But this is really, in the end, about making sure that Canadians have the ability to find the content and services they want. This is part of a series of proceedings that are going to allow us to finish our major policy work related to implementing the Online Streaming Act. As many of you know, late last year, we launched consultations on audio modernization, a consultation on definitions of Canadian content in the audiovisual space, which is to say television. In a few short weeks, we are going to be launching a consultation on audio policy that will consider things such as definition and funding of audio. So what is this one about? Well, the consultation on audiovisual content and the forthcoming one on audio policy really focus on specific content. How is it defined? How is it created? How is it funded? How is it discoverable within the system? Today's consultation is more about how the system as a whole works. It's much more focused on the services that offer content and then how Canadians get access to those services that bring the content to them. In other words, it's really about the rules of the road. Unlike some of our other consultations, we're not presenting a lot of preliminary views. That's because we're trying to do two things. We're trying to understand the dynamics of the market. And as we walk through the consultation, you'll see we ask a lot of questions that are about how is the market changing? What is influencing it? What should we consider? And then look at our tools. Because what we want to have is a system that will be adaptable for the future, not just one that meets the moment for today. Although, when you read this consultation, you'll see a lot of it is focused on the rules for conventional audiovisual services, that is to say television. But there are questions of relevance to audio services. There are questions of relevance for streaming services. It's a natural thing to say, if there's a rule that exists for conventional television, could it or should it be applied to streaming services? We're certainly not saying that we are going to impose any rules on streaming services along those lines. We are saying it is natural to ask that if you have questions trying to achieve things in one policy space, should you look at another one? It's a very complicated consultation, and we know that not everyone's going to want to answer every question because we're going to cover a lot of ground. So that's a bit of the context. What are the goals? What are we trying to do? Well, there's really two key goals. The first one is to have a sustainable model for the delivery and discoverability of diverse Canadian Indigenous content. That means the system is designed so that Canadians can find today and in the future the diverse audio-visual and audio content they want, including news. Now, there's an important principle here. Canadians should be able to access and discover content, but that does not mean that we're guaranteeing that those content services will succeed with audiences, that their business model will work, and we're certainly not trying to force anyone to watch anything. We want to ensure choice and ensure that there are choices built into the system, but not direct Canadians in what content services they must consume or how they interact with different technologies. We also need to build a system that will be responsible for changing viewer preferences on various platforms and adaptable to technological change. We realize that we're at a moment, at an inflection point, really a crossroads. Technology is changing, audiences are changing. We need to have a flexible system for the future. So that's our first goal. How do we build a sustainable system that will work today and in the future? The second goal is to have a fair and competitive marketplace. Now, we feel that the broadcasting system should have fair and transparent rules for small, medium, and large services. We have some rules today. The question we'll be looking at is, are these rules effective? Should we intervene more or less in a competitive marketplace? And the principle here is going to be, we should only be intervening when something supports a public policy objective established for us by Parliament in the Act, not trying to move the system in a direction we want just because, in theory, we could. Those are our two objectives, a sustainable model and a fair and competitive marketplace. But what are the actual questions we're going to ask about? So I'm going to divide them up under the two themes. Firstly, we're going to ask questions about how do you build a sustainable model for the delivery and discoverability of Canadian and Indigenous content. When you get to the section of our notice of consultation, what you'll see is that we ask a lot of questions trying to understand the current and evolving market dynamics, and then we turn to tools. So we're going to ask questions about how are services accessing the broadcasting system. And when I say services, imagine an independent channel. I don't want to start naming them because then it sounds like I'm picking favorites. But if you think an independent channel that wants to get on cable or satellite or on Amazon Prime or on any other service, how does that actually happen? What are the barriers? Are there opportunities offered by changing technology? Do we have rules that either encourage or hinder innovation in access to content? So we're going to ask questions around that to try to understand that better. We're also going to ask questions about the discoverability of services. You may remember that in our consultation on Canadian content, we ask about the discoverability of individual content. Here we're going to ask about the discoverability of services. You want a service, an ethnic language service, a sports service, a comedy service. How do you find it? Where is it offered?
Nobody.
That sort of brings us into asking questions about connected devices, because people now access material in completely different ways. So these are all going to be questions that help set the ground for what are the dynamics of the current market. Then we're going to turn to the effectiveness of our existing regulatory tools. We have a lot of rules in our current system that apply to conventional television, such as mandatory carriage, and I won't go through them all because there are a lot. But there is a question: are these tools effective? Do they still make sense in today's environment? Should they be changed, revised, expanded upon? Should they apply to streaming or not? We are posing all of those questions so that we can really come out with a better idea of what will help make a sustainable model, again, with the objective that Canadians get access to a wide variety of content in different ways on the platforms they choose to access it. That's theme number one. Theme number two is where we'll look at a fair competitive marketplace. Now, under this theme, we're also going to pose questions about our existing tools that are meant to support fairness. There's a lot of them, and I won't go into them. If you want more details, we can certainly ask questions. But, for example, we're going to ask questions about what does it mean to have good faith in bargaining? What should the rules be around data gathering and sharing? Because a lot of how negotiations happen now are based on access to data. And there are people who say it's asymmetrical, and some people have advantages and others don't. And is that fair? And the last part there is
Obviously,
we're going to
that's
look at
not
dispute
fair.
resolution, which
Do we have
is
to
a
ask
huge
that
topic.
question?
But basically, right now, the commission is involved in certain kinds of disputes, whether it's through mediation or final offer arbitration. Do we have a role there? Does that make sense? And if we do, should it go farther? If not, what should we do? Again, at every point, we're going to be asking the question, what does this do in the end to create a system that will help Canadians get access to the services they want? This hearing is very much exploratory. As I said, in some of our other hearings and consultations, we give preliminary views. Here, we want to really have a public discussion that helps us understand these market dynamics, helps us build these rules, and we're encouraging stakeholders to bring ideas to us. When they do, though, we're going to say, bear in mind that in the end, we're trying to achieve the objectives in the Broadcasting Act. Root your arguments in that. Tell us how a system should work that will achieve those objectives on behalf of all Canadians. Consultation launched this afternoon. It will be open until February 24th. After that, there's a reply period. So if you make a submission before February 24th, you can then reply to other people's comments. That will be open until March 11th. And we are foreseeing a public hearing beginning on May 12th of this year. Now, just before I wrap up and turn it over to questions, I am going to make an assumption about a question we're going to get, and I'm going to try and answer it in advance, which is, what about an election? There is no election call today. Obviously, we can all theorize, but we don't know when an election call may happen. The commission is going to proceed with its work. It's going to proceed with the deadlines it's established. Should there be an election writ dropped, at that point, we would be consulting with Privy Council office on the caretaker convention. We'll have contingencies in place, but we're not going to speculate on hypotheticals. Right now, we have an agenda and we're going forward with our work. Should there be an election that comes during that anticipated period of work, we will adjust as necessary. J'aimerais inviter mon collègue, M. Pierre, simplement de refaire un peu la dernière section. Ça, c'est la question clé. And after that, we'll be open to take questions. So, Dan, do you want to just give us a quick review of the key questions?
Oui, merci Scott. Donc, pour reprendre ce que M. Shortliff nous a dit au sujet des questions proposées pour l'avis de consultation, pour ce qui est des questions reliées à l'objectif numéro 1, soit celui de promouvoir un modèle durable pour la diffusion et la découvrabilité d'un contenu canadien et autochtone varié. Donc, l'avis propose des questions sur la façon dont les services accèdent au système de radiodiffusion, ainsi que sur les défis et les possibilités qui existent. On veut comprendre s'il existe des obstacles à la disponibilité de types particuliers de services de contenu. Et on veut vraiment savoir si les règles actuelles encouragent ou entravent l'innovation. Ensuite, on va proposer des questions sur la découvrabilité des services et ce, à savoir si les Canadiens sont en mesure d'accéder aux services et aux contenus qu'ils désirent. Ensuite, nous aurons une série de questions sur les appareils connectés tels que les téléviseurs intelligents. Et notamment dans l'objectif de savoir comment ces appareils influencent l'accès au marché des services de contenu. Et puis, enfin, pour l'objectif numéro 1, on va tourner notre attention vers l'examen de nos outils réglementaires existants pour l'accès, à savoir si les outils sont encore pertinents dans le contexte actuel et s'ils sont pertinents pour les services de diffusion en ligne. Et puis pour ce qui est des objectifs, des questions centrées sur l'objectif numéro 2, soit celui d'assurer que le marché soit équitable et concurrentiel. On va commencer en posant des questions sur nos outils existants qui sont destinés à assurer qu'il y ait une concurrence loyale et des relations équitables pour les entreprises de radiodiffusion. Et on parle ici d'outils comme le code de la vente au gros, à savoir si c'est encore pertinent. Ensuite, nous aborderons également la question de comment interpréter ou définir le principe de bonne foi dans la négociation, principe qui a été ajouté à la nouvelle version de la loi. On propose également des questions sur la collecte et le partage de données, plus particulièrement sur les différents renseignements dont disposent les parties qui négocient des ententes commerciales. Et puis, enfin, on va examiner le règlement des différends et plus précisément le rôle du Conseil au niveau du règlement des différends compte tenu du contexte actuel du système de radiodiffusion canadien. Donc, c'est à savoir si les outils sont encore pertinents et efficaces dans le marché actuel, s'ils devraient être adaptés, élargis ou réduits. Et comme vous le savez peut-être, le Conseil fait preuve d'outils comme la médiation assistée par le personnel, les règles de statu quo et l'arbitrage de l'offre finale lorsqu'elle fait du règlement des différends. Donc, c'est vraiment à savoir si les outils sont encore pertinents dans le marché. Donc, pour conclure, le Conseil préconise pour cet avis une approche qui est davantage exploratoire afin de bien cerner comment l'évolution de la dynamique du marché affecte les divers joueurs de l'industrie. Évidemment, on vous encourage à participer et à nous faire part des idées, des propositions. La période de commentaires sera ouverte jusqu'au 24 février. Et puis, la date limite pour les dépôts des répliques sera le 11 mars et l'audience publique débutera le 12 mai. Comme M. Shortliff a mentionné à la fin de son discours, au niveau des élections, il y a beaucoup d'incertitudes autour de la question, mais à ce point-ci, rien n'a été annoncé jusqu'à présent. On procède comme prévu jusqu'à ce qu'il y ait une annonce. Et à ce moment-là, nous consulterons avec le conseil privé afin de voir comment la convention de transition va s'appliquer. Donc, je pense que ça termine la présentation et puis on est ouvert à la période de questions. Merci.
Thank you so much. We would now be happy to take questions. We'll start with one question and one follow-up. We ask that you use the raise hand feature to signal when you have a question. Reminder to please keep your microphone muted otherwise, and that Scott and Dan's comments can be attributed. Nous serons maintenant heureux de répondre à vos questions. Nous commencerons par une question et un suivi. Nous vous demandons d'utiliser la fonction « Lever la main » pour signaler que vous avez une question. Nous vous rappelons de garder votre microphone en sourdine à moins que vous ne posiez une question et que les commentaires de Scott et Dan peuvent être attribués. I see we already have some folks in line, so we'll take a question from Marie first and then go over to Anya. Marie, go ahead.
Oh, hi. I wondered if I could just follow up on what you said about the election. You said that you'll adjust as necessary if an election is called, which we do expect. Can you explain what that means? Does it mean that you will halt the consultation in its tracks? Does it mean that the entire regulatory process will be wound up? I mean, presumably you've thought about this, and I wondered if you could just expand on what your plans are, or hypothetical plans are anyway.
Okay, so what I should say is that during the election period, there's a convention that you consult with Privy Council office because you should not be making news that could become part of the election campaign. If there's an election called, we will consult with Privy Council office on that convention. That said, the fact there's an election does not stop any of our consultations. It could perhaps theoretically change some of the timing when we're doing a few things. But our consultations that we've announced will continue. They're still valid whether or not there's an election. We're still building the record and we will still be anticipating public hearings.
So just to follow up, and I know you're on the record, are you saying that effectively it's business as usual with this consultation, that there may be a slight readjustment, but you are going to continue and follow the timetable that you've set out?
Yes, it will be business as usual. We plan to follow the timetable we've set out. The timetable could be affected by an election, but the fact that we're having a consultation would not be changed by the fact of an election.
Thank you so much. Over to Anya.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thanks for taking my question. I wanted to go back to what you said about how we're at an inflection point and there's technological change. And I was hoping you could explain what you meant by that. Are we talking about how people aren't watching traditional TV as much as they used to? How people are turning to international streamers more and more? All of the above? Something else?
I'd say pretty much all of the above. I mean, one of the things is, and you'll actually find this language that we're in a crossroads in our consultation, we're aware, and I'm going to read you the actual line, and then I'll give you a little more. Canada's broadcasting industry is at crossroads, facing profound changes driven by technological innovation, shifting consumer habits, and global competition. Which is to say that we recognize that when Canadians access material now, they're using different technology. It's changing technology, and they are looking at internationally available content. And that means that when you look at a system that was fundamentally in some ways designed around a closed system, a walled garden, the Commission has to bear in mind that rules we have to take into account that reality, and that Canadians seek out content in ways that they didn't seek it out in the past, and that they access it using technologies that weren't available in the past. So when we say we're at a crossroads, it's pretty much to say that, we've built rules and built a system of rules that have, we think, served the country very well in the past. But as we look at changing technology, changing consumer habits, and the realities of today, we know that our system needs adjustment in the future. And that's why we want to better understand the market dynamics and then adjust our rules accordingly in such a way that will support the two big themes we had, that we'll have a sustainable broadcasting system where Canadians can access what they need to access, which includes news, and that we'll have a fair and equitable system where you have small, medium, and large players in the system, and it shouldn't be overly dominated by any one of those groups. So that's what we're trying to recognize in saying that we're at a crossroads right now.
And so as Canadians kind of viewing habits move from this walled garden where they were watching traditional TV that was under CRTC regulation to increasingly watching, content on international streamers that are so far unregulated, I mean, to what extent could this be an existential threat to the Canadian broadcasting system?
That's actually, and I'm very glad you phrased it that way. That is exactly the questions we're trying to get at this consultation. Because if the Commission had put forward preliminary views, which we haven't, you could either argue, well, this will help the broadcasting system, but at the expense of choices for Canadian viewers, or you could argue that this will harm the system. We're trying to understand what's happening in the system to see where there should be rules and who they should apply to. Now, we're not assuming that means that we have to regulate online streamers. That may be an outcome, but it may not be an outcome. The starting point has to be we have to understand the market dynamics, how Canadians get access to services and what they and how that may evolve in the future, and then try to design something around it. So I think the question you're posing is exactly the question we're posing. How will we intervene in the system appropriately to achieve our public policy ends, but to ensure that there is a Canadian broadcasting system that is bringing diverse content? And when I say diverse, that means a diversity of content. It may mean official language minority and Indigenous and other kinds of content, but in a broader sense, it just means a diverse range of voices that Canadians can access a lot of different content, including Canadian broadcasting content and Canadian news. So that's exactly the question that this consultation is built to try to help us answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have Kelly up next, but I notice we have no other hands raised in line. So if anyone has additional questions, feel free to raise your hand. Si vous avez des questions, c'est l'occasion de lever la main. Kelly, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. It was really about, as you mentioned, dispute resolution at the CRTC. While these consultations are happening, will that have an impact on the current disputes in front of the CRTC or some of the decisions made sort of later on?
Thank you very much for the question. So the short answer is no, because we're a quasi-judicial tribunal, which means that we have to follow our rules as established. Disputes that have come before us under our current and existing rules, we'll be examining under those rules and under those procedures, and we'll proceed on until such time as there's decisions coming out of this proceeding where we change the rules. And we think that's the fairest and most transparent thing to do. We don't want to start rewriting rules on the fly saying, well, we're not going to make decisions because these rules might change, because they might change, they might not change. So Our existing dispute resolution tools remain in place. We're going to keep using them. We're going to keep on adjudicating disputes on that basis. For people on the call who don't know, we offer services such as staff-assisted mediation. We have final offer arbitration. This really only applies to conventional television that's not used either in the audio or streaming space currently. But after this consultation, when we've examined those rules, there will come a point where we issue a decision. Those rules may change at that point, and at that point, we would start applying changes to them.
Okay, and in terms of what that would look like, would that essentially being like issuing a commission letter saying to maybe resubmit a complaint or something to that effect?
I think it's a little premature because we don't know. We haven't gotten there yet. We don't know what the decisions are. And based on the amplitude of the decisions, whether it's a minor tweak versus a wholesale change, it's too early for us to speculate how we might implement things at that time. We would bear in mind that if there are disputes before the commission, we would obviously have to make transitional measures. But it's premature for us to say what those might be.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Last chance for questions. S'il y a d'autres questions, c'est notre dernière occasion. Going once, going twice. All right. As there are no further questions, we will conclude today's briefing. Thank you so much for joining us. Comme il n'y a pas d'autres questions, nous allons conclure la séance d'information d'aujourd'hui. Merci tout le monde.